Under globalization, the United States trade policy was restructured after the model of the British East India Company. The cost of goods, which would otherwise be skyrocketing, was lowered in essence by looting the caloric intake of the populations of the developing world. This did not reduce the effects of inflation so much as spread it globally. Meanwhile, U.S. production was gutted even further, literally packed up and shipped overseas, where an underfed, undereducated, overworked labor force cheapened the immediate costs of production. At the same time, a move was made to addict the American population to lines of credit.
The first thing you do is you make sure that they don't earn enough money to buy what they need without taking on debt. And that comes from killing the productive side of the economy. So that instead of having high-paying manufacturing jobs, a lot of high-paying jobs, you have these low-paying service jobs, retail jobs, things like that. And with globalization, we've seen a continual downward push on wages under the theory that we have to be competitive in wages with some country on the other side of the world. This method of using debt to control is very important. And it also gives you some insight, considering how in debt the United States is, of how some of the what some of the levers are that are used to control us.
Over the course of the 90s, the mechanisms created by Greenspan for rolling over the debt continued to snowball. The derivatives market spread across the globe.
Every time they turn around, they will create a debt. They will calculate the anticipated income on the debt that they just created. They will then capitalize the income they just fictionalized. They will take a multiplier factor, say a 3% ratio, okay, it's the corresponding figure. Right? So now you capitalize a debt, an asset of that magnitude. There's nothing behind it. It's only the imagination. So it's like what happened in Weimar, the Weimar 1923. Only in the imagination does this system viable. This system is measured in these kinds of estimations in quadrillions of dollars of estimated value. But nobody ever produced those quadrillions of dollars. They're not being produced now, they never were produced. Which means that the system depends upon the assumed income, like an interest income, on a debt which is not real. So it's not the fact that you have a boundary condition of a finite amount of value. The nominal value is just expanding with no reason whatsoever in absolute madness. Now you're calculating the profit based on the yield, the average yield, on this mass of fictitious value.
This carnival reached its limit in the autumn of 1998.
In 1998, you had the Russian government announced that it was postponing payments on some of its government bonds, the GKO bonds. This sent shockwaves through the financial world. Not because the amount of money was significant, because it really wasn't that much money, but because here was a sovereign government telling the financial markets no. If a government says no and can back that up, then the game is over.
In a desperate effort to re-inflate a collapsing system, the Y2K scam was launched. Consumers were convinced that come January 1st, 2000, all functions run on the two-digit date system would come to a screeching halt. Calendars would roll over from December 1999 straight to January 1900 unless new software was purchased to further inflate the tech bubble. Hotshots with no skills other than website design became millionaires overnight. The NASDAQ stock market index soared, nearly tripling over the next 18 months.
The way they dealt with this was a thing that George Soros referred to as the wall of money. the central bank started lowering their interest rates and flooding the markets with liquidity, trying to get people to buy again. And then you had this scheme to create a tech bubble, to pump up the high-tech stocks, the internet stocks, the computer stocks, and that sort of thing, as a way of getting things going again. So they started pumping a bunch of money into these things and actually created, going into the last half of 1999, a mania. So we went from, oh my God, the system just died, to a mania in a year. And in the mania, the tech bubble mania, everybody was buying stocks. It was, your cabbie would give you stock tips, that kind of stuff. And everybody wanted in on it. People were using their credit cards to buy stocks because the things were just all going straight up. And they just kept going up and up and up until it blew up. And then it was all over. But the effect of it was to bring the system back. It restarted it.
After the blowout of the Y2K bubble, the critical point of discontinuity was reached. The final phases of looting the U.S. physical economy had to commence, and new avenues of money pumping had to be found. The looming specter of terrorism following the September 11th attacks distracted the population from the hemorrhaging economy, while serving as yet another pretense to pump in more cash. Simultaneously, enormous amounts of money were offered to the now deregulated banks for home loans. Banks began appraising housing prices at higher and higher levels, and new housing development skyrocketed.
This is especially the baby boomers. I want this. I want this. I need this. I need 2 houses. I'm going to go into debt to a mortgage to have a house that I like. Huh? And I'm going to get a deal. I'm going to get a good deal. Huh? I'm going to swindle my neighbors, whatever. Then I'm going to buy a second house on the same terms, using the credit from my first house to get a second house. Then I'm going to rent this out to people. I'm going to get rich.
The income streams from these new forms of money printing were used to inflate market values even further, while at the same time, vulture funds swept in to buy up the last remnants of the U.S. productive sector. By this time, the electricity grid was wrecked, the steel industry shut down, and the United States automotive industry packaged up and shipped out of the country. In many parts of the country, though reports of inflation were kept artificially low, the average cost of housing began to far exceed the average income of the population.
The system is geared towards producing more and more mortgages at higher prices. That what's called the housing market is actually not about housing, it's about mortgages. It's the selling of mortgages. It's debt farming. It's all about debt. You need a house in order to create the debt, so you build a house. But the purpose of all of this, what drives it, is not houses. It's mortgages.
With families unable to afford new homes, sales began to slow. A new means was needed to keep the bubble going. This came to be known by the name of subprime lending.
In 2005, the rate of increase of new money coming into as mortgages began to decline. And for a system like this, that's deadly. So the rate of the money coming in began to slow. In part because they were pricing the houses out of reach of much of the population. And as we have subsequently seen, once this process stops, everything starts to blow up. So they didn't want it to blow up. So they started easing the terms of the loans to try to sell houses that people couldn't afford to people anyway. The whole idea was to sell people houses they couldn't afford because that was necessary to keep the system going. And that's what the subprime loans were. That's what these Alt-A loans, the low documentation, no documentation, adjustable rate mortgages, and all these things, this is all a response to the fact that they had priced themselves out of the market. The housing market was beginning to collapse, and they were doing everything they could do to keep it going.
by offering more and more risky loans to more and more people who could